Welcome to the show, Brian.
Katie, it's great to be here. I really appreciate all that you do with the show, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here, and also being such an accomplished social sciences coming in here to talk about environmental behavior change. So I always start the podcast with asking everybody the same question, which is, for all of us here, we're all environmental engineers, scientists, city planners, people who are trying to really measurably make environmental change happen. But most of us do not come from a background of social science. We don't understand behavioral psychology very well, yet we're trying to make these big changes happen, often at an institutional level. Like, what is the problem when we are so in the dark about social science and just the real tangible nuts and bolts of behavior change?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you starting our conversation that way. I think the real challenge is that from an engineering standpoint, if you see a population that you need to behave in a particular way, ideally, you could envision people as a switch that you could flip, that this needs to be turned on here, this part of this neighborhood needs to be doing this part of the country needs to be doing that. And we know from human experience that people are more complicated than that. I think part of the challenge is that there also are often cut and dried cases to be made for a particular adoption of a technology. This, you'd think there's a case to be made. This is smart to do. People would do it if you just give them the right information. And unfortunately, education based on facts alone often doesn't really motivate the type of behavior change that we hope to occur. People do things not necessarily just purely irrationally. There's a lot of rationale built into their everyday behavior and what they're doing to try to get by in the world. And so we've got to unpack that and recognize that there are influences of habit and inertia and perhaps even misunderstanding under some circumstances, but also social dimensions to life. There are complicated reasons why people behave as they do. And if we can better incorporate that into our planning, we're going to do a better job in terms of getting people to go along with what we think needs to happen. And that's really where psychology as it relates to the environment can come in. I think that there are lots of instances where there are these dimensions that if you stop and think about your own everyday life and all the reasons why you do things, all the influences on you, you'll recognize that there's no any one single bullet usually. It's going to be a complicated array of things that are going to be necessary to get you to do what we hope you're going to do. But yet we don't take that same level of sophistication into a lot of these arenas. And so the good news is that there's a pretty wide range of social psychology literature, of communication research, social science research that could be adapted. And people are starting to do that to some extent, but I think there's a long way to go still. And that's where it's exciting, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to apply insights from human behavior to doing work to shore up our relationship with the environment.
One question that people keep asking me, and it seems to be in the zeitgeist of the environmental movement right now, which is a criticism of individual psychology or asks of individual people to take action when some people are saying that we really need big systems change. Like, why are you asking individual people to take action when we need the oil companies and the government to do it? And almost a despising, like some people are quite angry and aggressive towards the idea of, like, why are you asking individual people to action? It's not enough. And so I've been really diving into this question quite a lot in my own work, but I always like to ask it of the guests. I mean, if someone said to you, like, we're trying to save the planet, why are you asking individual people to take action when we need systems level change? I mean, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree that we need systems level change. I think that I tend to view these complicated problems as being a matter of often needing to inch towards a solution, needing all of the above. And so even if you're talking about needing a larger level change, individual change aggregated can still make some of that easier. And so that's why not? I mean, unless it's really going to be taking away from your opportunity to advocate for larger companies, for governments to be taking some of the steps that they ultimately are going to need to take. The other thing to recognize, I think, is that institutions, governments, others are usually, I don't know if it's necessarily right to think about them as standalone entities separate from human society. And so another way to think about this is that insofar as the society is shifting under one's feet, there are leaders that are humans that are attached to those that are going to be aware of, are going to be seeing some of this change. even if part of what happens is some encouragement of optimism that change is possible, you see all of a sudden large scale of different technologies. I think it can start to change the thinking about what the business case is for X or Y, or how scary or intractable some of this might be. And insofar as there is leader resistance to the idea that any of this would be acceptable, or that can also start to shift as well. So I view it as an all of the above type of strategy. We probably aren't going to get there on the basis of individual behavior change alone, but it also, by having those types of efforts, it can certainly make the job a little bit easier, and maybe it paves the way for some of the broader discussion, because we are all in this together. And as of right now, a lot of these institutions aren't run by artificial technology or they're run by human beings that are part of a society. So that's how I tend to think about it, is that it's complementary, certainly, to the larger discussions that we need to have.
Yeah, and from the way you've explained it, it sounds like it's really a wrong way to think that there are these two binary buckets of individual change and systems change, that all systems are made up of individuals as well as systems level design, and they're constantly working together. And you also have like a tipping point that happens. Like often you have these social movements that grow with individuals, and they essentially like enable these larger changes of governments and corporations. And the larger changes of government and corporations only happen when you have this groundswell of individuals happening. I mean, just in a way that they're all connected.
And I think part of what we need to do is probably think a little bit more creatively about like what some of the outcomes are. I mean, so if you're talking about, and it can feel hopeless sometimes, like, are we just talking about turning a light switch on and off? But instead, if you're thinking about the range of things that people can do in their life, part of what they can do is vote. Part of what they can do is take other action. Part of what they can do is decide on where they're going to live. Part of what they can do, and there are a range of behaviors that are really consequential for even policy level change that you're going to make. If you've got populations that are concentrated in particular areas, or they're doing particular things or aren't, it's going to have implication for what some of those changes are that you're trying to make. And even if you think about the demands or the pressures at a macro level on energy systems, generally speaking, it can change the calculus for what some of those larger changes need to be if you have a large enough aggregate and a critical mass of individual change. And so I think all of it fits together more nicely than people realize.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked you that question was to segue into the research paper, just in this context of that when I've tried to carve up the answer to that question, I realized that there are so many things that need to happen. And they all kind of happen on a scale of government only to individual. And I came up with this idea of like 6 buckets that I could kind of categorize different behaviors. And some really are government only. For example, a carbon tax, like you can't do that as an individual. The planning laws around parking spaces, if a major freeway is put in, these things are really, really government only. But however, even in the government only bucket, there still are certain individual actions that you can put into that. And then all of the different things kind of go along a scale. And then you have certain things that really are individual only. Like the government can't make you grow your own vegetables, right? The government, and also, so moving into the research paper that you worked on in regards to weatherization, I mean, in order to get an aggregate certain amount of energy efficiency of demand in terms of the kilowatt hours, etc., like you really need people to take certain individual behaviors in homes, no matter how much government support you have. If the system is totally there for you in every single way, we still need to go house by house, block by block, and make certain environmental upgrades to houses. And there's no way that you can get around that. And just the way property laws work and individual ownership, I mean, people need to do that of their own accord. So there's a huge amount of individual behavioral science that needs to be applied to the individual behavior change mechanism when we look at the building stock, which makes up about 1/3 of carbon emissions.
Right. Well, and there's something else important too that I think you just touched on, was just thinking about the respect for individual freedom, which varies by culture, for better or worse. In the US, have that as both opportunity and challenge as part of our cultural history there. But that does also complicate the possibility for mandates under some circumstances. And so it's useful to think about some of this as well. But what I also like about your sense of buckets, You might also think about that in terms of continuum. And you might also think about the kind of connections between some of those different levels. And that's where I think the inspiration for that paper that you're talking about came about, was consideration of a layer just beyond the individual. In a way, it has to do with individual perceptions, but we also might think about social. But to what extent other people in your life have a normative influence? To what extent does what other people are doing play a role? And that's a space that I'm not sure we've operated in very much. I mean, there have been some efforts and initiatives, but if you think about, on the one end, individually addressing a person as the recipient of a message saying, I need you to do X or Y. On the other end, we're going to do this for you from a government standpoint for a whole society. Somewhere in between is the possibility of kind of working indirectly through networks and social networks. And we know that social networks play a huge role in the diffusion of information, in the way that our response to the pandemic is unfolded, and our everyday lives. We are social beings. We are oriented towards interacting with other people, with one another. And so it makes sense to incorporate that. I think part of what we found compelling was the idea that you take something mundane like weatherization behavior. Probably, you could see that as being individually controlled.
Sorry, I don't like to interrupt, but can you just explain what weatherization is in case nobody's familiar with that word?
Absolutely. Yes. No, and I appreciate that. So if you think about behavior like weatherization, which we labeled that as really a category of behaviors paper, you might think about the need that many houses have to be prepared for weather extremes. And so things you could do to tighten up the insulation, for example, in a house, so that you don't have either heat escaping if you've generated that, or you've got weather differential leading to changes or drafts, those types of adjustments that can be made, sometimes relatively simply and easily, but they nonetheless take some work and effort. Sometimes they require working with a contractor, but nonetheless steps that can be taken to reduce the inefficiency in a house in terms of heating and cooling, and which we know is important given the really important role that heating and cooling play in individual house energy consumption. And so given that, we wanted to look at the extent to which that was a behavior which could be explained by various factors, and think about what that story tells us when we looked at it. So that was kind of the impetus for that paper. Yeah.
And what was the big message that came out of that? What was the big wow factor from that paper?
So from our standpoint, we had done some work on measuring knowledge about energy. And we'd also done some work on measuring practical knowledge about energy use in your house. So the degree to which you are able to make sense of an energy bill and the way that that was calculated. And I think part of the rationale for many individual campaigns is that we're going to show people, look, you can save money. If you take this step with your house, you can make your house more energy efficient. And it's in the realm of kind of factual knowledge and education. And what we found was that if you look at and measure those factors, you measure how much people know about how energy systems work, measure what people know about their sense of energy usage in the US, about whether or not coal is a renewable energy source, all of those types of things. You look at whether or not a person understands how to interpret an energy bill. You look at the actual housing that they're living in and the extent to which it may or may not need weatherization. You look at some of those factors. You'd think that you could do a pretty good job accounting for whether or not they'd weatherize their house. But then we added into the equation a social indicator. And that was the extent to which people had shared and discussed information relevant to this with friends and neighbors. And as it turns out, that was a predictive factor over and above all those other factors. And so it mattered whether or not this was something you talked about with the people around you. And so our conclusion was that there is certainly, I think, some degree of influence from a normative perspective. It could be that under some circumstances, people are learning practical tips and tools, but they're learning some value of this from trusted resources. And this relates, actually, that latter point, to something we found more recently, which is that in the general space of people's interaction with the environment, we've looked at, with a different group over at Duke University, people's response to weather warnings and weather related emergency information. What we found in that circumstance was that local sources tended to be trusted and matter. So there's something interesting about the way that people pay attention to the information environment, where there's some value in what people around you locally are doing and thinking. And I think part of it is your sense of their own direct relevance. So somebody on my block does this to their house, I probably see that and take that information in as being maybe a little bit more credible than just the more abstract sense of like, well, here's what people in Cleveland are doing, or here's what people in Perth, Australia are doing. I may not view that as being as relevant to my individual circumstance. So we've got to find ways. There's a challenge there, because from a scale standpoint, it makes sense to have international or only based messaging. But on some level, what can we do to let people know that this is relevant to them locally? And one way to do that might be to work through local social networks, because there's a sense of reinforcement of norms, but also a sense that you're making information seem locally relevant to people. So I think what we found in that paper was some evidence for potential communication strategies moving forward that might be interesting for people to pay attention to. I think what's interesting is that means you might go down a different path than simply putting together an informational brochure. What you might do is look to make salient to people what others around them are doing. And so to what extent can you make it, you think about this in the simple way that like housing contractors will ask to put a sign in your lawn, like saying, well, I'm the one doing this roofing work here. Similar, are there ways to make it apparent to people what something like a relatively invisible weatherization tactic might be? Like, to what you think about this, even with solar, sometimes it's pretty prominent, but in other instances, people aren't aware of actually what people are doing that's environmentally friendly in their house. How much can we raise the salience of that in neighborhoods? We think that maybe that would have an impact on this spreading amongst people in a way that an informational brochure might not. So that was part of the big insight. Yeah.
Right, because what I got out of it, it said that the people that had conversations with their neighbors or people around them about anything to do with weatherization, which / energy efficiency is how I'd think of it, were twice as likely to have done weatherization, energy efficiency upgrades than people who had maybe just had some factual knowledge. But it totally, I mean, this one insight, and this one insight has kind of been my world, like for the last year, and it comes up over and over again with everybody I interview, because in the world of government and city and utility programs, and even big NGOs, it seems to be the way it's perceived is that we have this large entity that is trying to communicate to individual people as if they are an island, and every person is an island. Yeah. And it's using this factual based approach, this economically reductive approach. I mean, economically quite broadly, like behavioral economics, like just pros and cons. This is why you should do it because of rational reasons, rational economic reasons, rational environmental reasons. But the way that it really happens is that you have an individual homeowner or a building owner take on something, and then they're like a tributary, they're like a feed, like a network effect out to all those people that could be walking down the street, seeing the behavior, that could be having conversations, that could be going to school, anything to do with any church groups or a swim club or something like that. So if you're looking about how to affect change, you really can't be looking, here's the big organization trying to get out to 10,000 islands. You really want to be looking at it like this network effect of tributaries, and like really thinking is, I mean, my job as a designer, I design these programs, and as a creative person, trying to think like, okay, one person has put on a solar panel, one person's put on insulation. How do I get them to tell that story?
That's right.
I mean, as a creative communications professional, it is my job to try and figure out how do I get them to tell that story to like 10 people around them. Like that's kind of the marketing job, not the big umbrella entity to all the islands. I mean, that's a big message here, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and so let's think about even some examples that we've seen in a negative sense during the pandemic in terms of human behavior. Things like early on panic buying of the toilet paper, right? Or other instances, which defied logic on some level, but it was a matter of when you've got a crowd, and a crowd psychology literally sometimes is seeing other people in the store people are moving, or the same thing with traffic patterns. Sometimes you'll see, people go with what the general, there's some perceived wisdom in what a crowd is doing, right? And so then it accumulates, and it actually builds momentum in that way. And I think that unfortunately we see that dysfunctionally sometimes for some types of things, but I think functionally and in a positive way, things can take off. And I actually, both in terms of human behavior, we see that. But it's also important to keep in mind, we have, I think, a misperception of the ways in which public opinion is stuck or reified sometimes. I think there are moments when we view some of these perceptions as really intractable. And then we see circumstances where that doesn't really seem to happen. If anything, a lot of our perceptions are actually remarkably fluid. A lot of political scientists will tell you that there is not necessarily the core stability in some of these perceptions that you might like to have under some theories, but nonetheless there's some fluidity. But that also means there can be remarkable moments of change. So if you think about this, even just in the political and civic context, there was a time and period when it was viewed that support for gay marriage, as an example, right? That wasn't going to, there were folks that thought, well, we're not going to get to a majority acceptance on that anytime in lifetimes. And over a relatively short period of time, kind of the pendulum swung, gates broke open, and you don't necessarily still have universal acceptance, but you shift to a majority opinion on something that was viewed even 5 or 10 years before as not necessarily likely to happen. I think we're at that point with a lot of these different ways of thinking about how humans need to live. I think partly it's a matter of getting people to take the leap based on their neighbors, working out for their neighbors, and realizing, look, you can live this way. It's okay to drive an electric car. It's okay to live in a house that is built this way. It's okay to live in this different configuration. You'll be all right. Your neighbors are doing it. It's working out for them. And I think that's a different way to, people don't necessarily have the time to weigh long factually based arguments. It's more a matter of they're trying to get through their life and in a comfortable way, keep them, their families healthy, looking for these kind of brief signals from others, like, all right, what's really the thing to do here? How are people getting by? I want to save the world. That's great. But I also want to live my life individually and kind of get through that. And looking around just for kind of quick signals, that's where I think the power of some of the social diffusion comes in sometimes. And I think from an engineering standpoint, we could make that a lot easier for people to see what was happening, what was being adopted. And that would be really exciting to have people working on that.
Yeah, we really need to kind of create a whole new discipline of design, which is like environmental social diffusion design. I'm going to coin that now. I'm going to go and write a blog article called Environmental Social Diffusion Design and get all my designer friends to get into it. But I really love that you brought up the example of gay marriage, because often when I'm talking about a lot of these topics, one of the objections I get, not so much from my super green enthusiastic kind of group, but more from kind of more established people. I don't know what I'd call them, but established people. These people don't care about the environment, Katie. Nobody's going to change. People are just fundamentally selfish. It's never going to happen. The world is just full of greedy consumers. And that can often, that's a really strong sentiment that is out there, both in real life and also in that is kind of does look like that, right, from the outside and in people's opinions. And what I try to remind people with this sense of hope and optimism, especially because there's such a climate doom, very negative mind space that's adopted by a lot of people in environment, is to remind them of the enormous social hairpin turns that have been done just in the last 100 years. Like gay marriage is probably one of the tightest timeframes of an enormous, just even, I'm 40 now, but in a very tight hairpin turn in perception. Also about race, just in the last 100 years, about women's equality. We've grown up with gender being reasonably kind of the same through my lifetime, but when was it you might know the year that women got the vote. When was it? 100, 150 years ago? It's
just about 100 so years ago here in the US.
Yeah, in my grandmother's age. My grandmother was alive then when what else is there? Smoking used to be really common. There's fur. We've seen fur have that. What else is there? Another one, smoking, fur, any others you can think of? But these enormous social movements that have changed. And I think when we look at carbon dioxide, I feel that we can do for CO2 what was been done for all of those. And we can do it in a reasonably short period of time.
I agree.
And get a lot of hope and optimism from all these examples.
Yeah. And so even if you take somebody let's even grant the point that there's some degree of selfishness in people, right? Just if I don't necessarily grant that, but imagine you did. even from that argument, people are still going to want air to breathe. They're going to want a place to live. They're going to want, like, there's a certain degree to which I don't think people want the dystopian world, even from a selfish standpoint. So some of it could be, it's going to be a matter of a sense of urgency. Once you start to realize, the problem is when it seems like there's an infinite capacity to be selfish that's not going to harm you individually, but as we're starting to see, of course, that becomes more salient. So that the direct harms and the limits on resources, I think that's, and then people are going to want to scramble for a solution in a hurry. So I think but I share your sense of possibility. A lot of it is going to be interesting in terms of timing on this. And so I think if we had all the time in the world eventually, but maybe we can actually see moments of real concern, but that there's heightened enough awareness that you see dramatic change, and dramatic change can happen in ways that would make a difference. So it's an interesting balance, but I don't think all hope is lost. I would agree with you on that. Yeah.
Right. And I suppose the way to make the tipping point and the tidal wave happen, to bring it back to your research and your expertise, is not to take both the educational and the rationalist and the what you call biospheric appeals, the environmental appeals approach, where we're just telling people facts about the environment or money, but to really take this social network effect, people having conversations with real people, changing their minds. Like you said, people's mind space can be changed. Just because you think one way, after a conversation, you can think a completely different way. That happens through these social networks, and to really think about as a social network design challenge, rather than we just need people to know how many parts per million are in the atmosphere, and then it will.
Right. Well, and so think about this too. So people vary in terms of their level of version or introversion, and that's an important here, because there are some folks that are going to be excited or happy to talk about their new insight in terms of like something they've done on their home property, but a lot of people aren't necessarily. And so I think about, like, to what extent do people know about steps that I've personally taken? I'm not sure. I mean, I think the people probably could guess, but I haven't necessarily been very explicit about it always. And I think that there's probably some value in encouraging and finding ways to help people tell their story about the choices that they're making. There are instances in which the pattern might be better than people expect in terms of the number of people that are doing X or Y, or the number of people that are open to it. And so to what extent can we lift up some of that for others to see? And I think that's going to take some work to kind of figure that out. But I think generally speaking, we might be pleasantly surprised, and then really be able to build on that momentum. And I think that that's some of the examples you talk about. That's kind of how that goes. People take a bit of a bold leap, and like, I actually think we've got the numbers on this. The majority is actually is in support. We just need to make that not a silent majority and make it outwardly available. I think there's ways cynically people have opted to operate to kind of bring out some of our darker tendencies, and to say, look, we're just going to explicitly say this and gamble that people, and unfortunately there's some of that's been operationalized as well. But I think we also have this positive possibility also. And there are a lot of the ways that we live were kind of handed down to us. And so there's a certain degree of comfort. We're like, oh, a house needs to look this way, or this is just what you do. But if given different circumstances, I mean, if we were born into a world of renewable energy, is there really anything inherent about the way that we are doing things that kind of speaks to the human condition? No, that it's the outcome of those things, that the comfort, the comfortably temperature regulated house, and the products that we enjoy as celebrating holidays or whatever. But if we woke up and all those things were supplied in a different way, I don't think that people would object. They would accept it. And so we have to get to that point on the other side of trying to maintain some degree of our human celebration of this life, fueled by different means. But I think that's where there's been a really unfortunate cynical framing of some of this, which is that somehow people's belief in a way of life, or even a conservative sense of wanting to hold on to that, somehow has to do with it being powered in unsustainable ways. And I'm not sure that, aside from people that are even directly involved in those industries, that there's necessarily inherent value that people place on sustainable energy sources. So.
Yeah, one of the threads that has come up through every environmental psychologist I've interviewed, which is explicitly declaring that people don't have bad things inside them that are driving this. So there's enormous, like, actually, when you take the academic lens and you actually give people tasks to do and you're testing it, you're not just looking out onto the world at a shopping mall and just judging everybody,
right.
But you're actually taking people through a proper scientific method with proper theories that people come out wanting to do the right thing. They're good. People are good. And there's almost like the environmental psychologists screaming out saying, it's not true that people are doing this because they're greedy and they're selfish and they don't care. Like that is not what is making people do certain things. It's got to do with people are actually trying to do, they're trying to be liked by their social group. They're trying to get by. They're trying to be good parents to their kids. I mean, okay, maybe every 1 in 50 people is genuinely a horrible person, a sociopath or whatever. But most people are optimized to be good, responsible people. And we need to tap into those desires to be good, responsible people. And this attitude that I feel like you can get with some environmental people, that it's just because people are greedy and selfish. I mean, I personally just emotionally just don't resonate with that just as a person, but it's really not standing up at all as a proper theory from all of these people that that I talk to about this.
I mean, I think so. If you think about some of those core, there's two things that come to mind. And I think we misunderstand people's general relationship. I do a lot of work on public understanding of science, and you can find headline stories that suggest that we're at this crisis point in terms of people's trust in science. And while there are concerning aspects of public opinion dynamics, it's actually not accurate to say that people generally, like, there's this wholesale and complete loss of trust in science. People generally trust science, actually. It's still, even now, like, despite other headlines. And I think that we have to remember that, and that's important. But I think the other thing that you pointed out, which I just would love to see us get to that point, we're not likely to get to a point where I don't think we'd want to, our base humanity, our interest in other people, our social nature, our interest in beauty, our interest in other values, like, that's probably not going to go away. We wouldn't want it to. But so can we find ways? I always think about the example of finding environmentally friendly ways to give people what they want in terms of fashion, for example, right? So you're not trying to take away kind of the core pleasure people might have, but finding a way to give them that in a sustainable way. I think people are very supportive of that. So it's like they hold on to some of what they're doing because it feeds this core human need. But if it could be provided in a better or more sustainable way, they'd be all for that. And so it's just a matter of, like, helping them imagine that possibility. Imagine where we have an indulgent world that feels like we're celebrating and having these positive emotions, and but a lot of the environmental education campaigns are focused on doing the right thing, making this sacrifice, on here's the specific reason for it. Instead, you could also still be celebrating, like, a world where there still will be birthday parties, or there still will be and we're not asking you to not be human, I guess, is the story there. So I'm not sure how we marry that all together, but I think we urgently need to remind people that, and kind of get people inspired to help people see the solutions so that we can retain some semblance of the life that we put together as humans on the planet.
Brian, it is my life's work to do that. Every day I am trying to reframe, and I've been doing it all my life, like really since I was even a teenager, trying to reframe the environmental sustainability message about the best aspects of human nature, that it's about beauty and community and love for the planet, and about having technology progress in a really wonderful way that complements ecosystems with our capacity to invent and design. It doesn't come at the cost of nature. We do it as one, and really trying to forge ahead this other kind of vision for the sustainability movement that is all about the positive sides of what humanity can be, and kind of a little bit of a war, just a very quiet war against my other fellow environmentalists that can be very aggressive and doomish and negative. And I don't necessarily think they shouldn't be doing that, because we wouldn't have the momentum. Like, why should we be bothered to make so much change if it wasn't bad? So I don't necessarily think we should stop sending out the negative messages, but I think in addition to that, we need maybe about 3 or 4x of whatever that energy is about telling the bad story, the doom story. We need 3 or 4x telling solutions, imagination, and really building campaigns that are branching from this positive centered kind of imagination, or this image of what we want humanity to be, and kind of pulling people into that vision.
So if you think about the trade-off, even in terms of, so there's arguments to be made for loss framed messaging and gain framed messaging and all that. But the problem and the challenge in the environmental arena is that I think you don't necessarily see a lot of effort to focus on gain framing. People said, well, people respond to a sense of imminent loss.
Sorry, what's gain framing?
Okay, so the idea that you could gain something positive as opposed to losing something. So a fear tactic where you have something, you're going to lose it, as opposed to, well, I can give you this nice thing if only you do this. But I think the challenge is that we've got people saying people are going to respond. We need to raise their fear and concern about, but they're not necessarily focused on celebrating or uplifting what it is that we're trying to preserve in terms of that part of humanity, and to reassure. It's more just a matter of, we need to do this as a last resort, like things are falling apart, whatever. But also, I think there needs to be some degree of reassurance that, and if we do, like, there is a positive future that's possible. Like I often think about, like, even, I don't know, I mean, it's sometimes blasphemous to point this out, right? But I also think it's hopeful. People need hope, and we've got to find a way to be realistic and to give them some degree of that. And if people feel a complete and utter sense of fatalism, they're just going to shut down altogether. But even looking into a future, even with the climate changes that we're seeing, and that, there still hopefully will occasionally be decent days for a picnic in some places if you're economically fortunate enough to have it. And not to say that that's enough to rest on our laurels, but just to point out to people that we're just trying to improve on some of these possibilities that are still on the table. Like that it's not. And I guess that's where I think we have this real push and pull, and problem with the doomsaying is that it doesn't give enough space for people to kind of sit with that and to see realistic possibilities for hope as well, that are urgent, that are necessary. We can't afford to lose everything. But I don't know. I just think it needs to be a balance. And I think that surprisingly, there's not much room for hope and optimism in a lot of these circles. And so I think the work you're doing is noteworthy in that regard, but it doesn't surprise me that it's maybe not as common as it could be. Right?
Well, did you see this thing called the Imagine Project that I've been posting on social media in the last, just assuming that you look at everything I do.
Yeah.
Did you notice that?
Maybe not everything you've done, but I've seen that. And I think I think the spirit of that really fits what we're talking about, right? I mean, I think that notion of the power of imagination for people is vital. And I do not think that people are inherently guaranteed to necessarily live their life in a way that's inspired by imagination, but we also know that they can. And so, like, I draw a lot of inspiration from, you're born into this world. There's no guarantee as to how your life is going to unfold. But we also know that with different experiences, with supportive families, with all there are great and wonderful possibilities for people. So I think we have to assume that people have the capability of imagining and of being inspired by it, which is not something we should take for granted. But I mean, there's a real latent possibility that I think that you're trying to tap into with that it's more, sometimes the bolder thing is to be optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love for you to have a listen to one of my latest podcast episode that I published, which is with Professor Joshua Wright. And he actually tested environmental imagination exercises on people, giving them an exercise where they would write this positive future. And it really jumped out at me because I'd never seen environment and imagination in an academic, I'd never seen it anywhere. And then I saw it in an academic paper and I was like, I gotta talk to this guy.
Yeah.
And so I was really happy to get this interview out there. But the way he frames it through the academic lens, I mean, my lens is just, I want to think about eco-cities and green roofs, but the academic social science lens is, he calls it a cognitive alternative, and really tests and understands the theories behind how powerful it is that people can actually imagine a cognitive alternative, and that empowers their sense of agency. Like, if you can't imagine an alternative world, you're not going to be amped up to make the day-to-day changes to make that alternative world happen. And it could be something, even if you think about simple, like something like weight loss, like
Yeah.
if you don't have in your mind that one person you might feel like 20 pounds overweight, and your mind is, this is my future self, which is when I'm in really great shape. I mean, it's that future self kind of imagination, or maybe it's like a home that you want to build, or whatever, a dress that you want to make. Like, you need to have that cognitive alternative to work towards, to do all the actions. And he actually found that by giving people this imagination exercise, it increased their actual day-to-day environmental behaviors. And he also gave them a campaign letter writing exercise. It was voluntary. After you'd done the imagination exercise, you could go, please write a letter to your local minister, whatever, about the environmental topic. And quite a lot more, I can't remember how much more, people who had done the imagination exercise went on to write the letter than the ones who were in the control group. So anyway, it's really interesting to listen to for a theoretical framework if you want to dive into it more.
I will. And I think what's also really crucial there is I don't think that for a lot of these topics, it's a matter of convincing people that a healthy environment is a good thing necessarily. It's more a matter of, so how do we get there? How do you help us get there? How do we collectively? And I think that gets taken for granted, but it's just not very easy necessarily for people to know, like to see how what they're doing. It goes back to your earlier question. If they see how it all fits together, see how a town or a city or a state has made a difference, or to see the tangible change. But I think we also have great capacity. People learn. We are learning. If we learn that something works, we will continue on with it, and it's possible to kind of set us down that path. I also take perverse hope from the timing of our current challenges. You think about how much environmental damage we've done in about 100 or 150 years, and we don't necessarily have 150 years, but still 150 years is not 10,000 years. It's remarkable what certain patterns that were rewarded in a short term. Systems get put in place, things kind of move in a particular direction. We made a lot of wholesale changes as a society, transformative maybe in a negative way, but in response to short-term rewards. But if we can make salient some of those rewards and some of that activity, I think we'd be surprised at the possibility for macro level change in over time. I just don't believe that. We don't have any good indication of society not being open to those kind of changes, because too much happens in particular towns in the life and history of them over time to suggest that they're not vulnerable to collective changes in perceptions and what's happening. So.
Well, it's really lovely to dive into these big topics, but because we're just with our last bit of time, I want to make sure that we cover all of the nitty gritty of the social science. So
understood. And you can use as much or as little of it as you want. I understand that. Yeah.
Oh no, it's lovely, but I make sure we get all of the nitty gritty covered. So I might ask you some more boring nitty gritty questions now. Where am I at? Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop the flow.
That's okay. No, whatever you need, it's all good. You can.
Okay. So moving into the nitty gritty of the behavioral science of how to make all of this stuff happen, with your particular research paper, or with what all research papers do, is that they push a little bit further in a way that the research hadn't been done before. Mm-hmm. So what was it that was particularly different that it was pushing into that hadn't been covered yet?
Yeah. So part of it is really just a data collection and measurement issue. And so there's a couple of dimensions there that I think we tried to make some changes with regards to that. One was actually even in the realm of energy related knowledge, the idea that there might be a distinction between more broad and abstract and theoretical knowledge and the more practical knowledge of like interpreting an energy bill. That was something that hadn't quite been done to the same extent that we did it. And so that in a way, that type of measurement was where my collaboration with Joe Murphy and other colleagues at RTI International started, was what can we do to improve upon your conventional energy knowledge measures? But then the thought was, so if something social is happening, how are we going to tap into that? You only know if that's a force that matters if you measure it, right? And so part of the simple innovation was asking people the question about interaction with others, which surprisingly doesn't happen as much as you might think. And so if you think about existing survey items that relate to a topic like weatherization, or it might relate to other energy behaviors, I'd ask for some of the listeners to think about how explicit there is an indication or a measurement of interpersonal interaction, or of social conversation, or of social diffusion. And if it's not there, it's not going to show up in a model as a predictive factor. So if we hadn't measured it in this particular case, our model would have looked different, and we wouldn't have known. We had been agnostic about the influence of social aspects. So I think that's really the step. We were just describing what might account for this particular behavior, but by having the insight, I think, to consider connecting this to a wide-ranging social literature, that was interesting. And that's something that connects back to work that I had been doing a while ago, which within social science, I also sit within a particular domain known as communication research specifically. And so there's something that I had learned along the way about the nature of communication research, which was an interesting insight. And for people that don't do work in that arena, this doesn't even make sense, like why this happened this way. But the truth is that over time, over decades, in a lot of academic departments that focus on communication, you'll get either a focus on mass communication, thinking about mass media, or those electronic media, TV, radio, internet, and so, or you'll get more an interpersonal focus, thinking about what happens in an individual, a dyad, what happens between a couple, what happens between individual human relationships. It's all communication. It should all be theoretically linked, but surprisingly, the literatures are pretty separate. So as one of the projects I worked on early on in my career was an effort to try to connect those. We have an old review paper on the roles of interpersonal communication in thinking about mass media campaigns. And so when I talked with Joe Murphy about it, this idea was that, well, let's think about what some of those interactions might look like. One of my first books actually was focused on social networks. It's actually called Social Networks and Popular Understanding of Science and Health. And it's just revealing I think it gets taken for granted because we know there are other people in our lives. We know that's the nature of humanity, but we don't really think about the subtle ways that the people around us have an influence on who we are, what we do, and all of that. So it was really bringing that into a specific model and a survey that was the insight here. And I think that we've seen some citation of the work from the years since it was first appeared that suggests maybe we were onto something there with that idea. And that's something that I think is an avenue for new direction now for people working in this arena.
And so what is peer-to-peer diffusion?
Yeah. So
and in particular, in regards to energy, so energy efficiency behaviors, what would peer-to-peer diffusion be?
So it could take a couple of forms, but imagine that in the days before the pandemic, if you're having coffee with somebody and you actually talk to them about the specifics of the work that you're having done on your house, that might be a way that the person you're talking to gets information about it that they hadn't gotten before. You can think about it now on a social media platform. Somebody posts a picture of a new solar panel that they put on their house, and they explain that this was a good contractor to work with, or I'm getting this information about it, or I'm getting this kind of performance. And then the other person learns about it, not through an advertisement, not through something they track down on their own, but through somebody's social media feed. So this notion of information flowing from a person to another person, from a peer to a peer, we know that that's the way that certainly a lot of misinformation travels that way. A lot of information about how things operate, people pay attention to. That's the whole basis for these social media platforms has been the recognition that people talk to one another. That's something you could tap into. And then people have gone and designed platforms around that. So I think that was part of the insight there. And that's our sense is that that's an important way that information could flow. Now, there's an important caveat here, which is we've also done some work that appears in some other places that suggests it's unrealistic to think that currently most people, most of the time, are having conversations about weatherization or about energy or about those topics. We know that in terms of, if you do an analysis of like how often and how prominent those topics are, they're not particularly common. And so when they happen, they're powerful and it matters, but they aren't necessarily what people are most likely to talk about. So I think part of the key for us is to figure out what people are talking about, right? And then how do you generate those kind of ways to make those conversations similarly popular? What is the equivalent of the furry kitten meme that we could have for thinking about energy and the environment? What are the ways in which we can encourage people to talk about this? Are there ways that could fit into the other reasons and motivations people have to talk to one another? Because if it doesn't fit into that, then it's unlikely to come up at the dinner table or the coffee table or over the backyard fence. And so that's part of the role I think we have to do as communication designers, as well as how can we remind people of why you should talk to your neighbors about this or how you can talk to them about it. Because I think they are going to need some help and encouragement, because it might be a little bit weird if you just start assuming that people are just going to walk down the street and start espousing some renovation that they made to their house, right? So
yeah, so piggybacking topics. And I've been having the same conversation with quite a lot of people about
great.
this, because people come to me, like my job is a behavior designer.
Right.
And so they're coming to me, organizations, asking me to try to come up with some graphical thing or a strategy to actually do this. And so like we've been saying, like the normal way it's been done before is let's just scare everybody about climate change and just give everybody a list of top 10 green tips. And that's really a very crude and probably not a very effective way to do it. Try to really like hack into how we actually manifest these conversations and give people tools. I mean, one thing that we were talking about was creating something that was like novel, because it can be awkward. You meet somebody, or you want to try to bring up like plant-based eating. I don't want to push. I eat plant-based, but I really don't like. I never ever push it. I'm not one of those vegan activisty people.
But it's
similar. It would be so awkward.
Right,
I wouldn't be like,
understand.
Hey, you like bad person eating a hamburger. I'm just not like that. But how could you bring it up in a way? And we thought of creating like pins that look novel, or little like 3-dimensional objects you could have in your house that would be unusual. Like what is that weird thing? Or like, what is that thing on the wall? And it would almost like invite the conversation. But I just had an idea of something I wanted to ask you in this idea of like, because a lot of this comes down to tradesmen. So like we can talk about the theory, but we're here with like a house and a tradesman and a job. And I've done a fair bit of work on urban heat islands. And one of the ways to help with urban heat islands is getting homeowners to paint their roof white. It's pretty, it's not too expensive, it's about $2,000 to do. And I think even like Los Angeles County will even pay for it. But nobody knows about that you can actually paint your roof white. It'll take down the temperature by like 10 or 20 degrees, really powerful. You can cut 40% of summer electricity consumption just by the lightening of the roof. There's even a subsidy, but it's hard to get people to know about it, to know how powerful it is. Really big deal for climate change. So I'm working on this and I'm trying to think of like, well, how do I get to encourage people to do this behavior? I'm here trying to think of it as a behavior designer. How do I make this happen? And one of the guys who I worked with at NASA introduced me to his friend, Tom. Now, Tom is not really an environmentalist. He's a really nice guy. He's a screenwriter with a family, owns his own house. And the heat island expert at NASA was just talking about Tom, because he said, yeah, like my friend Tom like painted his roof white. And he was like just amazed about how like instead of turning his air conditioner on at midday, he only needs to turn it on at maybe 5 p.m. now. And it made this really big difference. And so I said, can you introduce me to him? I'm going to interview him on a Zoom call, just like this. And so I just asked him about every detail about the house and how he got the contractor. And like, he showed me some photos, and Tom and I are kind of friends now. And we talk about roof whitening and his kids and stuff. And so basically I've got this like unedited Zoom call about roof whitening, like so boring. Like how is this an exciting topic? Like, white roof paint, right? Super unglamorous topic. But so anyway, this is my question to you. Like, so there's this guy, Tom. And there's the contractor, and there's the LA city, and there's the subsidy, and there's the people who make the roof paint. And there's someone like me who can design things and record Zoom calls and chop up video and do social media. What do we do with Tom to help every single person Tom knows copy him and him have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is figuring out, completely aside from roof whitening, like what Tom's social interactions are like and what his motivations are for having them. So if Tom was a teenager, which he's not, but if he was, you might imagine ways that you could try to encourage the roof to be a prop in some social media effort. You think about the nature of adolescent social media right now. For many platforms, it's a matter of finding ways to kind of continue a thread and to tag along. You're mimicking some dance move, or you're tagging people, but it's a way, it's an excuse to interact. You have something to interact over, and then here you're passing something along. So I can imagine under that it'd be like maybe different artistic ways to do something with the roof or whatever, or people, but in Tom's case, he may have different normal patterns for interaction. They probably differ between his family members and his friends, but maybe it's a matter of thinking about like kind of prepping people for, we know that there's some degree of anticipatory rehearsal that happens as people get ready for Thanksgiving, as people get ready for New Year's or whatever. And some of those conversations, you want to have them. You want to, if you're fortunate enough to have them in person, you want to go enjoy some pie and meet up with your family. But it's the same conversation every year. You don't know what to say, or you don't, well, maybe there's a way to encourage this as your, topic to have. I think about this partly. Icebreakers in organizations are well-intentioned, icebreaker activities to kind of get people talking, but people don't like them necessarily because they don't like being on the spot. They don't like not having. So I tend to think about, well, what can we do to help people get ready for icebreakers? What can we, can we give you this? Here's your ace in the hole story to talk about. So helping Tom to envision, like, what are the instances where it might be helpful to have something on hand to talk about under other circumstances. Maybe there are people that he connects with that would be really interested in the physical aspects of it. Like how did you make that work, or what kind of paint quality do you have to paint, even work on a roof when you're talking normally about other kinds of shingles, or I don't know, there might be some people who'd be interested in the technical aspect. And then maybe there's some aspect of his experience as you've talked with him about it that was funny or amusing, or some other that would give him the fodder for kind of a kind of silly or absurd anecdotal story that he could talk with some people about, because maybe there's some part of it that he's happening to relay, that he's got this white roof that he's put in. But what's really funny about it is that he dropped a can of paint on his head, putting it in, or so, I don't know. I mean, but there'd be some way to kind of think about how he normally interacts, what some of those and then can you insert or frame or coach up to get the topic talked about, as opposed to saying, hey, Tom, I really think you ought to talk to people about your roof. It's going to help save the world. Instead, be encouraging to kind of think about, well, the obligations we all have to interact with other people. Are there ways that this could be currency for that? And maybe it's not going to be universally successful, but if we get every other Tom to do it, that's better than it is now. All right. And I think especially, and I think getting at scale, some people to share some of this with 1,000 of their closest friends on a social media post. I mean, there's something to be said for that. I mean, we do have this, that's the way that we see some aspects of misinformation or other information we don't want to see escaping into the world because it's going viral. I think there's possibilities for some of this also to go viral under the right circumstance. So how can we find a way is there a photo filter or some other thing that's possible to give to Tom that's going to make his house look really good, or it's going to look interesting if he uses this, and he'll encourage him. Yeah, I never really post to Instagram, but I'll do it with this white roof because it looks good in the way that you've got this. I don't know. I mean, I'm just brainstorming on that, but I think it's a matter of figuring out what the obligations people have to interact with their social world, and then trying to match the energy efficiency or related content to that, rather than trying to force the square peg into a round hole. Yeah.
Well, my next group Zoom event is with a group called Mesh Minds, who I was actually working in association with for UNEP. And they make these little Instagram filters. So
great.
Augmented reality filters. So it's actually, they seem reasonably straightforward to make because a lot of influencers make them now. And if you press the star icon, you can use this particular software, and you can make people do it for like bunny ears on the head and type of things. Like, then you can make like really simple little games. So a lot of it is just superficial Instagram fun, but they specialize in making environmental campaign one. So they get people to try on, like, I don't know, like a gorilla that's like going extinct. And because they're so fun to engage in, they can potentially be the hook that creates the conversation, that actually creates that kind of change. So it does seem like it's this idea of being like a social diffusion designer. I'm really into this like idea now to get like, I mean, we can't dive in that deep right now, but I think with a team of like creative people and giving us a couple of hours, we could probably come up with a really amazing framework and really dive into this one topic. And it kind of made me think, if you have, say, if there is like all the Toms who are doing these things, and let's say we just have infinite resources for all the people to help, that every time there is a Tom doing one of these things, Tom has a session with the local city or environment's social diffusion mentor, a helper person, coach, social diffusion coach, and says, hi, Tom, I was just wondering, it's really important for us to spread these behaviors. Maybe we could just like chat about like a friendly psychologist coach person. If you have any events coming up, if you could talk to people, here we have like little cans of like tiny white paint that you can give out to your friends, and here's some trees. And it's like taking the time to kind of walk him through the kind of social psychology and like give him some tools and here's some free stuff, rather than just like, I don't know, giving someone merch and a t-shirt, very simplistic kind of marketing, or a bunch of stickers or please share it on social media, like a little bit like high level engagement. And it might sound kind of ridiculous to put that level of resources behind it, but honestly, I don't think it would be that hard. I think someone like him, he was obviously really excited to share his roof experience. And if somebody was part of a program to have like a 45-minute phone call with him to try and encourage him, I mean, that could be really worth it financially. It's high touch point, you know, but I mean, governments and utilities are spending millions of dollars on stuff that doesn't work very well right now. So it could work, right?
I think honestly that, I don't know, there's you can think about investing a ton of money in the equivalent of a Super Bowl television advertisement, a one-time broad reach, highly designed, persuasive message, or you can think about the million smaller touch points that could have in seeding all this change. And I think I'm leaning towards investment, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is not necessarily even having to move the needle that far, but it is going to take eyes and ears and boots on the ground, and having a lot of local contact points, and a lot of, I think that's exactly the right way. And I think part of the reason it doesn't happen is people get tired, or they're like, all right, well, this works, but they don't scale. This worked with 70 people, and they don't scale it to, if we get that replicated to 100,000 sets of 70 people, we would start to get somewhere. But how do you get to that point of scale? And that's something that's really hard with a lot of the types of things that we're talking about, is actually getting investment in scaling and replication of locally developed interpersonal types of initiatives. If we can get to that point, then I think we're going to be somewhere. So.
Well, you don't necessarily need to do it forever, right? You just need to do it till it gets momentum to a kind of a tipping point. So once, in theory, once it starts to get going, you might only need to do it through like a batch process until it becomes the new kind of social norm.
Well, and I mean, let's think about it, not to drive everything back to the pandemic. People have bemoaned the fact that we're not everywhere. We're not to the levels that people might want to see us in terms of vaccination, but we've made tremendous progress too. And we'll have to see if this becomes an endemic and all that. But there's a certain degree of a push over a short period that gets you to society to a different level. So similarly, like with your white roof example, you're going to need some maintenance and upkeep or whatever, but the biggest push is going to be initially. If you actually had 80% of homes with this right now, it would make a big difference. And you wouldn't necessarily have to encourage that every year, right? I mean, that's something worth keeping in mind. Some of these things that are a little bit of effort, but that don't have to be sustained every day, that's something I think worth doing. Trying to encourage people to take that step that once they do, pays off dividends for 10 or 15 years at a time. I think that's a really smart type of thing to invest in. So.
Yeah. And I think just from my own experience, I mean, I've done like a lot of marketing and social outreach over the years. I used to run a media company. I mean, I have a book, I have a podcast, like there's a lot of like social media building and outreach and building a following and putting campaigns out. And it may not look on the surface that that's what I do, but that probably takes up about 75% of my day-to-day work. And what I've really noticed now that I've started to get a bit more traction and started to get better at sharing my work in this new social media landscape, and also really trying to promote environmental campaigns and actual real environmental behavior change, is just how manual it is. Like, people think that you can get a viral video out there and then you'll just like, you'll get like an app that will scale. I've worked on a whole bunch of different apps and softwares, and there's this idea with, I live in Silicon Valley and I kind of live the Silicon Valley startup life, and that you'll start an app and then it will scale and then it will go viral and then all these people, it'll grow. And in my experience, that has never, ever happened. I have reached a certain snowball effect with certain things I work on, but the reality is it's super hand holding, it's manual, it's DMs with people on LinkedIn, on Twitter, meeting people in real life, having real phone calls with people. And I've never experienced a non-human, internet only big change campaign take hold, not with anything I've done. And I think that's what the fantasy that everybody wants, that something will just happen on its own with marketing and not through one person at a time.
Yeah. And I think honestly, part of what's really unhealthy about that perspective too, is that people assume then that if you've tried and it doesn't take off virally, that it wasn't necessarily a good idea. I think I tend to think about it in terms of the metaphor of like building a fire or whatever. There's a certain degree of kindling, certain degree of getting it started. Once started, it might burn quickly. It might actually kind of hit a tipping point where it takes off. But the threshold for that is much, much higher than people realize. And so all along the way, there are really good ideas that languish for quite a while, that are working in small neighborhoods or small pockets that just don't take off. And investors and funders and evaluators, sometimes there's an assumption that like, it didn't spark and go viral. Well, that doesn't mean it's still worth the effort to try to do this, to get it out. And eventually, then certain times there is a massive level of investment where things eventually hit a point where there is some degree of momentum, where things are kind of, you see that with some product launches and some things where you've got market dominance and all that. There's a certain, like, so the social media platforms have gotten to a point of prevalence now where there's momentum, but it takes a long time to get to that, or a lot of individually seeded effort to get people to get to that critical mass. So yeah, I agree. So I think it's but it should be a point of inspiration for people and not necessarily discouragement.
Yeah, I think people have got to get really real with this idea of just, you've got to be like boots on the ground, feet on the street, person to person, and really fall in love with that process. I mean, that's something I've learned, I feel like, over the last year or two of really doing this. At first, it was like, oh my God, it's so hard to engage people because of a sense of failure and futility around it. And then I realized that I was like, no, I got to go one person at a time and do this, and that there's a real joy and a love in that human connection. And now I've built this incredible community of real people that I really took the time to get to know as humans, not as social media followers or emailers or somebody who might put on a solar panel, just some data point that might give me a commission, but really focusing on the real human connections that I'm making and just like letting it grow like that. And people come to me for design consulting with their app and with their software, and they're like, how do we make it grow? How do we make it change the world? And I'm just like, it's not going to happen in the app. It's going to happen in the human and the human relationships. Maybe they'll use the app, but it's really, really person to person.
Yeah.
So that's what our conversation is about. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to share this, to talk about this with you, because I mean, it might sound normal for you. You do it every day, but in our environmental world, it is not a conversation that's being had.
Well, and I really, I appreciate your interest in the topic and the insight you have, and happy to help shed some further light on it. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, wonderful. So I just finished with 2 more questions, and I do have another call at exactly 10:30. So we've got no more than 6 minutes.
I'll do it quick.
Okay. So my last 2 questions, second last question is, if you could look 100 years into the future and the world would be dramatically improved, everything we would hope it for, what would be the one thing that you would change or make happen to get us there?
I think I would try to find a way to tap into what I know is in the hearts and minds of people individually, and to try to break down some of the systems that are controlling or manipulating that. So find a way to activate individual change, but connect people to one another in a positive way, rather than necessarily have us living in fear of what we can't do. Yeah.
And what are you most excited about researching in the future?
I continue to, looking ahead into the future, I'm really interested in trying to understand communication dynamics in the world that we live in, and trying to get better at measuring and capturing what's happening in real time and feeding that into systems. And so looking forward to finding ways to partner with some of the advances we're seeing in computing technology, and just trying to creatively match theory to the actual measurement that we're doing in order to improve the human condition through research.
Okay, well, this was wonderful to be able to take
Great.
such a deep and nuanced dive
Great.
into the social psychology of how to just, it's really simple, just get people to have conversations about stuff to change the world. It doesn't really necessarily need to be that fancy. So thank you so much for joining me today, Brian.
Hopefully,
this was a real pleasure.
Yeah, no problem. I really enjoyed it, and good luck with all you're doing.